Jesus speaks and the storm stops. The sun was dipping low beyond the hills that bordered the Sea of Galilee, its fading light spilling molten gold across the rippling water. The day had been long, filled with the press of crowds and the endless needs of the broken. Jesus had healed the sick, comforted the grieving, spoken parables that stirred the heart and confounded the proud. His voice had been carried over the hills by the warm afternoon wind, a melody of hope for those who heard it. As the shadows stretched across the shoreline, Jesus turned to his disciples and said, in a tone both gentle and resolute, "Let us cross over to the other side." The words seemed ordinary enough. The disciples did not question him. Some among them, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, were fishermen who knew these waters as well as their own heartbeat. The journey was routine, or so they thought. They pushed the small wooden boat from the shore, its hull scraping over wet sand before gliding onto the glassy water. Jesus stepped aboard and found a place at the stern, resting his head on a worn cushion. The day's work had drained him, and his eyes closed as the gentle rocking of the boat lulled him into deep sleep. The disciples handled the vessel with skill, their oars dipping in unison, the sail catching the evening breeze. They spoke in low voices, recalling the wonders they had seen that day. The leper who had fallen to his knees and risen with skin like new. The man whose legs had been useless now walking with steady steps. The faces of the crowd as Jesus spoke with an authority unlike any other. But even as they talked, a subtle change came over the air. The breeze stiffened. The golden hues of sunset deepened into bruised shades of purple and gray. The fishermen among them exchanged glances. Storms could form suddenly on the Sea of Galilee, whipped into fury by winds descending from the surrounding hills. Yet there was something about this growing darkness that felt different. Within minutes, the wind had risen into a howl, slamming against the sail and sending the boat pitching. The gentle waves of the evening became surging walls of water, pounding the vessel with merciless force. Spray stung their faces as they gripped ropes and oars, fighting to keep control. The sail snapped and strained, the wooden beams groaning under the stress. Peter shouted instructions, his voice barely carrying above the wind. Andrew worked furiously to steady the sail, while James and John bailed water with their hands and whatever they could find. The lake was no longer a calm expanse. It was a wild, churning chaos, a black, heaving monster intent on swallowing them whole. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning flashing and illuminating the terror etched on every face. The storm's fury was beyond anything they had faced before. Each wave threatened to roll the boat, to end their lives in a heartbeat. And through it all, Jesus slept. Water streamed down their hair and into their eyes. Their hands were blistered from the ropes, their voices hoarse from shouting. The night was no longer just dangerous, it was deadly. For every seasoned fisherman on board, the knowledge was inescapable. They were losing this battle. John clung to the mast, his eyes wide with dread. "We can't hold it," he cried. Peter, chest heaving, looked toward the stern and saw him, Jesus, still lying there, the storm raging around him, and yet his breathing steady, his face untroubled. The sight struck Peter with equal parts desperation and disbelief. He stumbled toward him, nearly thrown from his feet by the next wave, and gripped his shoulder with shaking hands. "Teacher!" Peter shouted over the roar, his voice breaking. "Don't you care that we are perishing?" The others turned toward him now, their fear laid bare. They were not calling on him as a last step of faith. They were calling on him out of utter hopelessness. Jesus stirred, his eyes opened, clear and calm even in the chaos. Slowly he sat up and rose to his feet, the wind tearing at his robe, the rain lashing against his face. There was no fear in him, only an authority that seemed to radiate from within. He moved toward the bow of the boat, each step steady despite the violent rocking. Facing into the darkness, he lifted his hand toward the raging elements, and then he spoke. His voice did not compete with the storm, it commanded it. "Peace, be still." The words fell into the wind like stones into water, deep, certain, unshakable. And instantly, the impossible happened. The wind died. The waves that had risen like towers collapsed into gentle ripples. The roar of the storm faded into silence so profound that the disciples could hear the water dripping from their clothes. In moments, the sea lay flat as glass, reflecting the pale light of a moon breaking through the clouds. Every man on that boat stood frozen, their mouths hung open, their chests still heaving from the fight they no longer had to wage. The fear that had gripped them moments before had not vanished. It had changed. Now they feared the one who had just silenced the wind and the sea with a word. Jesus turned to them, his gaze steady. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The words were not sharp, yet they cut deeper than the storm's bite. The disciples looked at one another, their minds struggling to grasp what they had just witnessed. Whispers rose among them. "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The boat drifted forward in the stillness, the oars dipping slowly into the now quiet water. The air smelled of rain but carried no threat. The stars began to emerge overhead, twinkling in the vast darkness. No one spoke for a long time. They rowed on, each lost in thought. They had followed him as a teacher, trusted him as a healer, marveled at him as a prophet. But tonight, they had seen something greater. He was not merely a man with power from God. He was the master over creation itself. As the shoreline of the other side grew visible in the dawn's first light, they knew their lives could never return to what they had been. They would face other storms in the days ahead, some on water, some in the hearts of men, and others within themselves. But this moment, when he spoke and the storm obeyed, would be etched into their souls forever. For the rest of their days, whenever the winds of fear rose and the waves of doubt threatened to pull them under, they would remember the Savior was in the boat, and his voice was enough to bring peace to even the wildest storm. The sun was beginning to sink low behind the western hills, bathing the Sea of Galilee in liquid gold. The air was heavy with the scent of water and the lingering dust from the day's crowds. It had been a long day, perhaps one of the longest the disciples could remember. Jesus had been teaching from morning until late afternoon. He had stood at the water's edge, then sat in a boat pushed out from the shore so the swelling crowd could see and hear him. The multitudes had come from every direction, fishermen smelling of salt and sweat, merchants in fine linen, mothers clutching infants, the crippled leaning on sticks. They pressed in, desperate for a word, a touch, a miracle. And Jesus gave them all of himself. He told stories of seeds falling on different kinds of soil, of lamps that must not be hidden, of mustard seeds growing into mighty trees. His words were layered with mystery, yet pierced hearts like light through darkness. When the last parable ended and the crowd began to disperse, the disciples saw the fatigue in his eyes. The lines of weariness on his face could not hide the compassion still burning there. He turned to them and said quietly, "Let us cross over to the other side." Peter, who knew the lake as well as his own reflection, gave a nod. "The wind looks good. We can make the far shore by nightfall." They climbed into one of the fishing boats, its hull well worn from years of use. The ropes were coiled neatly, the oars smoothed by calloused hands. Jesus settled in at the stern on a low cushion, his robe gathered under him. As soon as his head rested against the wood, his breathing slowed. The rhythm of the waves beneath the boat seemed to cradle him into sleep. The disciples busied themselves with the familiar task of sailing. Andrew adjusted the sail to catch the evening breeze. James checked the knots, while John scanned the darkening horizon. The others talked quietly, voices low, as the boat glided away from shore. For a while, the crossing was peaceful. The water shimmered under the fading light, and the first stars pricked the deepening blue above. Peter's voice carried across the boat as he recalled the leper Jesus had healed with a single touch. "I've seen skin cleansed by the river, but never like that," he said. It was as if the disease had never existed. Matthew, sitting near the mast, leaned forward. "And the paralytic," he added, shaking his head in wonder. "I'll never forget the look on his face when he stood. He didn't just walk, he ran." John smiled faintly. "It's as if his words create the very thing they speak." They spoke with quiet awe, still trying to grasp the fullness of what they had witnessed. Yet as they talked, the air began to shift. It started with a subtle coolness, a draft that slid across the surface of the water and raised a slight shiver along their necks. Andrew paused mid-sentence and glanced over his shoulder. Dark clouds were massing over the eastern ridge, rolling in with unnatural speed. Peter's brow furrowed. That's coming fast. The breeze stiffened, filling the sail with a sudden snap. The boat tilted and water sloshed against the side. The disciples exchanged quick, uneasy glances. They had all seen storms blow in unexpectedly on this lake, but something about the way this one moved made the hair on their arms stand up. Within minutes, the calm evening had turned restless. The wind was no longer gentle but fierce, hurling itself across the water and slamming into the boat. The surface of the lake transformed into churning swells, each one higher than the last. Andrew shouted over the rising roar, "Pull the sail in!" James and John scrambled to obey, but the wind tore at the canvas like a living thing. Peter gripped the tiller with white-knuckled hands, fighting to keep the bow facing into the waves. Rain began to fall, first in scattered drops, then in sheets that blurred the shoreline from sight. The boat pitched violently, throwing them against the rails. Untroubled breaths. The wind screamed, the boat shuddered, and yet he slept as if the storm did not exist. A fresh wave slammed into the side, sending Andrew to his knees. The desperation in the men's faces deepened. They knew these waters. They knew their own strength, and they knew they were losing. Peter staggered toward him, gripping the rail for balance as the boat pitched again. He grabbed Jesus' shoulder and shook him hard. "Teacher," he shouted, his voice raw from salt and fear, "don't you care that we are perishing?" Jesus stirred. His eyes opened slowly, as if he had been resting in a place far removed from their panic. He looked at Peter, then at the others, their eyes wide and pleading. Without a word, he rose to his feet. The wind tore at his robe, rain running down his face, but he stood steady. He moved toward the bow, planting his feet against the rocking deck. Every man watched him, holding their breath as if the next moment would decide their fate. He lifted his hand toward the chaos, and his voice rang out, not loud but full of a power that seemed to sink into the very bones of the storm. "Peace, be still." The words fell like a command the world had no choice but to obey. At once the wind stopped, not lessened, not eased. Stopped. The waves that had towered above them melted into gentle ripples. The thunder faded, the lightning vanished, and the rain softened to a whisper before ceasing altogether. The silence that followed was almost as deafening as the storm had been. The disciples stood frozen, the only sounds their heavy breathing and the drip of water from the boat's edges. Jesus turned to them, his gaze calm yet piercing. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The question cut deep. They looked at one another, unable to speak. Moments ago, they had feared the storm. Now, they feared the one who had silenced it. They whispered among themselves, voices trembling, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The boat drifted forward, the oars dipping slowly into the still water. Above them, stars emerged, bright and clear in the cleansed night sky. No one spoke for a long time. Each man sat in silence, the weight of what they had seen settling on them like a mantle. He was not merely a rabbi, not merely a prophet. The wind and the waves had recognized his voice, the same voice that had spoken creation into being. As dawn broke and the far shore came into view, the men knew their lives would never be the same. They would face many storms ahead, some on the water, some within their own hearts, but they would carry this night with them forever, for they had learned the most unshakable truth of all. When the Savior is in the boat, no storm can prevail.